In 1986, a company that started by making looms for silk weavers shipped a tiny four-wheel drive truck to America. It cost $6,200, two-thirds the price of a Jeep Wrangler. Within a year, it was outselling the Wrangler 2-to-1. Jeep had been building four-wheel drives since World War II. Suzuki had been building them since, well, they bought a bankrupt company in a fire sale. This is the Suzuki Jimny. And this is how the cheapest 4x4 ever made humiliated some of the biggest names in the automotive world. And here's what makes this story genuinely wild. It's not just about a truck, it's about a loom factory. A bankrupt startup that sold 45 vehicles total in its entire existence. A Consumer Reports conspiracy that destroyed a brand overnight, and two guys from Chile who drove a 21-year-old budget truck past a Jeep team's record on the highest active volcano on Earth. 3 weeks after Chrysler erected a sign that said Jeep parking only, all others don't make it up here anyway. I'm going to walk you through all of it, every embarrassing detail. Because the Jimny story is one of the most underrated case studies in automotive history, and almost nobody tells it completely. This is Engineera, and I spend way too much time thinking about what happens when the smallest, cheapest vehicle in the room quietly outperforms everything else. If you're someone who loves digging into the real stories behind the machines that changed the automotive world, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Okay. To understand how a tiny Japanese truck embarrassed an entire industry, you need to understand where it came from. Not from some grand automotive dynasty with decades of engineering heritage. Not from a company with a racing pedigree or a military contract. From looms, literally. Weaving looms. Mikio Suzuki was born in 1887, the son of cotton farmers in a small coastal village called Hamamatsu, about 120 miles from Tokyo. The village was known for textiles and woodworking, not exactly the cradle of automotive innovation. At 14, Mikio apprenticed under a demanding carpenter named Kotaro Imamura. 7 years of strict, unforgiving training. When the Russo-Japanese War started in 1904, demand for carpenters collapsed, and Imamura was forced to take work maintaining looms on a factory floor. He considered it beneath him. His apprentice disagreed completely. Michio flourished around the machines. He found inspiration in mechanical systems that would define the rest of his life. He finished his apprenticeship in 1908. By 1909, at age 22, he had watched his mother struggle with her primitive hand loom, designed a pedal-driven replacement that wove cloth 10 times faster, and founded the Suzuki Loom Works. Word spread through the village. Orders came in fast. For the next 30 years, the company did nothing but build weaving machines, and they were genuinely good at it. Their sarong loom, which used an innovative punch card system to weave patterned cloth, was exported across Southeast Asia and won national industry awards. The company went public in 1920. By the late 1930s, Michio held over 120 patents for loom technology. Then he decided he wanted to build cars. He completed several prototypes by 1939. Decent ones, actually, featuring liquid-cooled 4-stroke 4-cylinder engines and surprisingly modern design for the era. Then the Japanese government declared civilian passenger cars a non-essential commodity because there was a world war coming. The project died. After the war, Suzuki went back to making looms. Then the cotton market collapsed in 1951, killing loom demand practically overnight. Suzuki pivoted hard. Motorized bicycles came first. The Power Free in 1952 with a tiny 36 cubic centimeter 2-stroke engine. Then proper motorcycles. Then in 1955 they finally produced their first car. The tiny Suzulite. The company formally changed its name to Suzuki Motor Company in 1954. But look, this story isn't really about the Suzulite. It's about what happened when Suzuki's engineers decided they wanted to go off-road. In the late 1960s, the engineering team was studying a vehicle called the Steyr-Puch-Haflinger, a small Austrian military off-roader. The idea was to build something similar but smaller, something that fit Japan's K-car regulations. K cars had strict limits on length, width, and engine displacement, But owners benefited from lower taxes, cheaper insurance, and reduced registration fees. Building a proper off-roader that qualified as a kei car seemed almost contradictory on the surface. Every serious off-road vehicle in the world was big and heavy. The logic was that weight and power were prerequisites for capability. Suzuki's engineers weren't convinced. Then something better than a blank sheet of paper came along. In 1968, a tiny Japanese outfit called Hope Motor Company went bankrupt. Hope had designed a small off-road vehicle called the Hope Star on 360. It was crude. No doors. A Mitsubishi-sourced 359 cubic centimeter two-stroke engine making 21 horsepower. The rear axle came from a Mitsubishi Colt. The wheels came from a Mitsubishi Jeep. It was essentially a box of Mitsubishi parts arranged on a basic ladder frame and given a new name. Top speed was about 43 miles per hour, dropping to 30 in four-wheel drive. It was not a refined machine by any measure. Hope had managed to sell about 45 of them total. That's not a monthly number. That's not a quarterly number. That is the entire production run. Ever. Mitsubishi was offered the design and passed on it without much deliberation. Suzuki's director, Osamu Suzuki, saw potential where nobody else did. He overcame fierce opposition within his own company and bought the entire operation. His colleagues thought he was wasting corporate money on a failed product from a failed company. He wasn't, and history would prove them spectacularly wrong. The engineering challenge Suzuki's team now faced was deceptively simple on paper and enormously difficult in practice. Build a real four-wheel drive vehicle with a proper transfer case, low-range gearing, solid axles, and a ladder frame chassis, but make it small enough and light enough to qualify as a kei car. That meant staying under 3 meters in total length, under 1.3 meters wide, engine displacement under 360 cubic centimeters. Here's what most people don't realize about that constraint. Every single competitor building serious off-road vehicles was heading in the exact opposite direction. Land Rover was getting bigger with each model year. Toyota's Land Cruiser was growing heavier and more powerful. Jeep had been scaling up since the original wartime Willys. The entire global off-road industry operated on one core assumption. Capability requires size, weight, and power. Suzuki looked at that assumption and rejected it completely. Their engineers argued the opposite case. A light vehicle doesn't need a massive engine to climb a steep grade. A narrow vehicle can thread through forest trails where wider trucks stop dead. A short wheelbase can negotiate tight switchbacks that longer vehicles can't even begin to navigate. Weight was the enemy of off-road performance, not the foundation of it. Suzuki took the Hope Star chassis, threw out the Mitsubishi engine, and installed their own air-cooled 359 cubic centimeter two-stroke twin-cylinder making 25 horsepower. They redesigned the body from scratch. They kept the ladder frame because it was sound engineering, not compromise. They added a proper part-time four-wheel drive system with a dedicated transfer case offering both high and low-range gearing selected by a physical lever in the cabin position between the gearbox lever and the handbrake. They fitted leaf springs and solid beam axles front and rear. The same fundamental suspension architecture found under the full-size Land Rover and Toyota Land Cruiser. Vehicles that weighed 3 or 4 times more and cost multiples of what Suzuki was planning to charge. And to keep the total length under 3 meters, they mounted the spare tire inside the vehicle behind the front seats. This made it a 3-seater instead of 4, but it preserved the kei car classification and its financial benefits for the buyer. Tax savings trumped a 4th seat. That's a very Japanese engineering decision, and it tells you everything about the priorities baked into this vehicle's DNA. In April 1970, the Suzuki LJ10 rolled off the line. LJ stood for light Jeep. Subtle name, Suzuki. It weighed 590 kilograms, about 1,300 pounds. For context, that's less than a modern superbike with a sidecar. It had 16-inch wheels and a top speed of 47 miles per hour. It looked like someone had put a Land Rover in the dryer on high heat. and it was the first four-wheel drive K car to enter series production anywhere in the world. The entire first year of production was done by hand because Suzuki hadn't anticipated real demand from the market. They were wrong about that. 5,000 units sold domestically in year one, outselling the Mitsubishi Jeep in Japan. The vehicle that Mitsubishi had declined to build was now beating Mitsubishi's own product on home territory. That detail should have sent a clear message to the rest of the industry. Most of them didn't notice. Suzuki scrambled to set up a proper assembly line. They never stopped improving the vehicle underneath. 1972 brought the LJ20 with a water-cooled engine and, crucially, left-hand drive variants for export. That was the signal. Global ambitions announced. A U.S. company called International Equipment Corporation imported a few thousand of these early Jimnys, selling about 3,500 units, mostly in California, Nevada, and Arizona. Not a sensation, but an unmistakable proof of concept. By 1975, the LJ50 arrived with a larger 539 cubic centimeter three-cylinder engine, initially targeting Australia. Then the LJ80 arrived with an 800 cubic centimeter four-cylinder. The second generation launched in 1981 with a redesigned chassis, improved road behavior, and a 970 cubic centimeter four-cylinder engine. Body styles multiplied. Convertibles, hardtops, pickups, five-door wagons. Australia got it as the Sierra. Spain's Santana Motors assembled them locally with softened suspension and cloth interiors for European buyers. In India, Maruti Suzuki produced it as the Gypsy for the military and police. The platform was genuinely everywhere. Africa, South America, Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe. It was becoming one of the most widely distributed vehicles on the planet, quietly, without fanfare, without billion-dollar marketing budgets. And then Suzuki decided to take on America properly this time. In 1985, the second-generation Jimny arrived in U.S. showrooms wearing a new name, the Suzuki Samurai. It packed a 1.3-liter four-cylinder making 63 horsepower. 0 to 60 in 16.9 seconds. Quarter mile in about 20.5 seconds. Those are not performance numbers. Those are patience numbers. But here's the thing. Performance on pavement was never the point, and Suzuki knew it better than anyone. The Samurai had manual locking front hubs, a 2-speed transfer case with real low-range gearing, leaf springs, solid axles, and a ladder frame chassis. Genuine, serious off-road hardware. At $6,200 base, a loaded one with options hit about $7,500. The Jeep Wrangler started north of $9,000. Suzuki had undercut the most famous name in off-roading by a full third of the purchase price. And they were clever about the rollout in ways that most people overlook. Dealerships opened initially in California, Florida, and Georgia. Each Samurai shipped with a full accessories catalog. Roof racks, bumper guards, upgraded wheels, light bars, brush bars. Suzuki understood something about the American truck market that many foreign companies had missed badly. Americans don't just buy off-road trucks, they personalize them. They make them expressions of identity. Giving customers the ability to customize at the point of purchase, with a factory-approved catalog of bolt-on pieces, was a genuinely smart move. Suzuki planned for 1,200 imports per month. Conservative, reasonable, cautious. They sold 47,000 units in the first calendar year. By mid-1988, they were moving 8,000 units a month. 150,000 sold across 3 years. The Samurai became the best-selling convertible in the United States. Not the best-selling off-roader, the best-selling convertible, full stop. It also captured the best first-year sales record of any Japanese car company entering the American market. And in 1987 it outsold the Jeep Wrangler by nearly 2 to 1. A loom company from Hamamatsu was beating Jeep at Jeep's own game, on American soil, in American dealerships, with 63 horsepower and a price tag that made the Wrangler look expensive. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but how does 63 horsepower actually compete off-road against vehicles with twice or 3 times the power? This is where it gets really interesting, and this is the part of the story that most automotive coverage completely glosses over. Physics. Start with weight. The Samurai tipped the scales at around 2,300 pounds. The contemporary Jeep Wrangler weighed closer to 3,000. That 700-pound gap is not trivial. It is the difference between floating across soft ground and digging into it. Lighter vehicles exert less pressure per square inch on whatever surface they're crossing. They ride over surfaces that swallow heavier trucks whole. They require less engine output to climb the same grade. They're substantially easier to extract when stuck. 63 horsepower pulling 2,300 pounds actually has a more favorable power-to-resistance ratio than 112 horsepower dragging 3,000 pounds through deeper ruts cut by the heavier vehicle's own weight. The ladder frame chassis underpinned the entire off-road equation. Unlike unibody construction, where the body panels themselves are load-bearing structural elements, the Jimny's body sits on a separate steel ladder frame. The frame can flex and twist over uneven terrain without cracking body panels, distorting door frames, popping windows, or causing any structural failure in the cab. Hit a rock with the body and you've dented sheet metal. The frame underneath is completely fine. The structural integrity of the vehicle remains intact. This is why you see old Jimnys with battered, deeply dented bodies still running perfectly after decades of abuse. The damage is cosmetic. The skeleton underneath doesn't care. Solid beam axles at both ends gave the Samurai genuine wheel articulation that independent suspension systems fundamentally cannot replicate in the same conditions. When one wheel climbs over an obstacle, the opposite wheel on the same axle is pushed downward toward the ground, maintaining tire contact with the surface below. Independent suspension, which almost every modern crossover and many modern so-called SUVs use, lets each wheel move separately. That's excellent for highway ride comfort. It is genuinely terrible for keeping traction on broken, irregular ground. When an independently suspended wheel drops into a hole, the opposite wheel doesn't compensate. It stays where it is while the dropped wheel loses contact with the surface completely. The Samurai kept 4 patches of rubber on the ground in conditions where more sophisticated, more expensive, more technologically complex vehicles had wheels spinning uselessly in the air. The 2-speed transfer case was the real force multiplier buried inside that simple little truck. High range for normal rear-wheel drive operation on regular roads. 4-wheel high for all-wheel traction on slippery surfaces. 4-wheel low for serious technical terrain. In low range, the effective torque delivered to the wheels roughly doubled while vehicle speed was halved. This is the part that most people miss entirely when they laugh at the Samurai's horsepower number. Run that modest 63 horsepower output through low range and drop it down to first gear, and the mechanical force reaching the actual tire contact patches was more than sufficient for steep rock faces, deep mud, and river crossings that stopped heavier, more powerful vehicles cold. Horsepower is an overrated metric for off-road capability. Torque multiplication through gearing is what actually moves a vehicle over obstacles. The Samurai's transfer case had a lower final drive ratio in 4-wheel low than the Wrangler's equivalent setting, meaning it could operate at even slower, more controlled speeds on technical terrain before the driver needed to consider any other option. Control, not brute force, is what gets you through serious terrain without damage to the vehicle or the landscape. The Samurai's compact dimensions created geometry that worked continuously in its favor. Short wheelbase, narrow track, almost no front or rear bumper overhang beyond the axles. This translated directly into steep approach angles, departure angles, and breakover angles. The Samurai could climb steeper inclines without the front bumper bulldozing into the hillside before the wheels reached the slope. It could descend sharper drops without the rear end catching and dragging. It could crest ridgelines without getting hung up at the center of the vehicle over a peak. Bigger, longer vehicles with their lower front bumpers and extended wheelbases routinely beached themselves on terrain the Samurai could skip across without a second thought. Experienced off-roaders figured this out rapidly. Size isn't always an advantage in the trees. The vehicle that fits between them and keeps moving is the one that reaches the destination. The vehicle that can't fit the gaps becomes an obstacle itself. The engine was deliberately, intentionally simple in ways that turned out to be profound advantages in actual field use. No turbocharger to fail at altitude or overheat during sustained low-speed climbs where there's minimal airflow for cooling. No complex electronic fuel injection system to malfunction during deep water crossings or throw cryptic error codes 60 miles from the nearest cell signal. No computers managing the four-wheel drive engagement and second-guessing the driver's inputs. Every critical system was mechanical, tactile, direct. A physical lever engaged four-wheel drive. Manual locking hubs required the driver to get out and turn a dial on the wheel hub itself, confirming their commitment to the terrain ahead. If something broke in the backcountry, a basic toolkit and some mechanical intuition could get you home. At extreme altitudes where fuel injection systems stumbled in thin, oxygen-depleted air, the Samurai's simple carburetor could be rejetted in a parking lot by anyone with a screwdriver and the right jet kit. Reliability through simplicity isn't a limitation. It's a design philosophy that the industry has largely abandoned. And drivers operating far from infrastructure pay the price for that abandonment every time something electronic fails beyond the reach of a dealer's diagnostic computer. Which brings us to perhaps the single greatest, most delicious humiliation the Jimny ever delivered to a major corporation. In 2007, Chrysler was launching the new JK generation Jeep Wrangler. Some enthusiasts were skeptical about the four-door configuration and the replacement of the beloved inline-six engine with a V6. Jeep wanted a statement, a spectacle. Something that would put the Wrangler back at the absolute top of the capability conversation and silence critics with a single, definitive act. So Chrysler built two modified Wrangler Unlimited Rubicons fitted with Goodyear MTR tires, winches, and electronic altitude measurement equipment. They hired German expedition leader Matthias Jeschke and his professional extreme events team. People who do this kind of thing for a living, with full corporate backing, full logistical support, full equipment budgets. The target was Ojos del Salado, the highest active volcano in the world, sitting on the Argentina-Chile border at 22,615 feet above sea level. The climb took 5 days. Hurricane-strength winds. Temperatures down to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Punishing high-altitude glacier traverses across sheer ice where a single mechanical failure or navigation error could be fatal. Oxygen thin enough to make basic thinking difficult. The Jeeps reached 21,842 feet above sea level, a legitimate, hard-won achievement by any reasonable measure. Jeschke declared the Wranglers unbeatable at altitude. At Jeep's direction, his team erected a sign at the high point, Jeep, parking only. All others don't make it up here anyway. Chrysler issued a glowing press release calling it definitive proof that the new Wrangler stood apart from every other 4x4 on the planet. The record lasted approximately 3 weeks. Two local Chileans from the Atacama region, Gonzalo Bravo and Eduardo Canales, had been planning their own attempt for months. Their vehicle was not a new factory-backed machine with corporate sponsorship and a professional support crew. It was a 1986 Suzuki Samurai, 21 years old at the time of the attempt. Bravo had modified it himself over time. Stronger axles, lower gear ratios, air lockers, larger tires, and a supercharged G16A four-cylinder engine adapted for the extreme altitude, but still a Samurai. Still the platform that was designed from its very first day to be the most affordable 4x4 a person could buy. First attempt, January 1, 2007. Snowstorm. They had to turn back before reaching the record altitude. Second attempt, a month later. The engine caught fire at 20,731 feet when a hydraulic reservoir failed and sprayed fluid onto the hot exhaust manifold. They towed the burning truck back down the volcano, repaired it, regrouped, and went again. On April 21, 2007, Bravo and Canals drove their Samurai past the Jeep team's high point and kept going. They stopped at 21,942 feet, 138 feet higher than the factory-funded, professionally crewed, corporate-backed expedition. On the way down, they found the Jeep parking-only sign lying flat on the ground, blown over by Andean winds. They picked it up and brought it home as a souvenir. Guinness World Record certified the new altitude record in July. Two guys in a 21-year-old budget truck, self-funded, no corporate backing, no professional support team, had beaten Jeep on the highest active volcano on Earth. That is an embarrassment that no amount of marketing spend can erase from the historical record. But the Samurai's American story has a dark chapter that reveals as much about media power as it does about automotive engineering. In June of 1988, Consumer Reports published a review headlined, "Warning. The Suzuki Samurai rolls over too easily." During their proprietary short-course avoidance maneuver, the Samurai tipped up onto two wheels during testing. The magazine gave it a not acceptable rating. The first vehicle to receive that designation in a decade. Footage of the near rollover played on television news broadcasts across the country for days. Sales fell off a cliff almost immediately. The estimates varied depending on the source you consult, but the broad consensus is that annual sales dropped from roughly 72,000 to somewhere around 2,000 units almost overnight. One magazine article, one piece of footage, destroyed what had been the fastest-growing automotive success story in the American market at that moment. But the story was considerably messier than the headline ever suggested, and the details that emerged over the following years deserve far more attention than they ever received. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, the federal body actually responsible for vehicle safety standards in the United States, later criticized Consumer Reports' testing methodology specifically because of driver variation, noting that NHTSA used robotic controllers in its own rollover resistance tests precisely to minimize the kind of human inconsistency that can produce unrepeatable results. Suzuki fired back aggressively. They presented evidence that Consumer Reports employees had been heard cheering when the vehicle tipped during testing. They alleged that the test course itself had been modified after a senior Consumer Reports executive, who was not a trained vehicle test driver, had managed to tip the Samurai during an informal, unstructured drive. That the testing evolved from a repeatable, methodologically sound evaluation into something more closely resembling an effort to force a rollover on camera for maximum visual impact. The lawsuit Suzuki filed in 1996 wound its way through the courts and reached the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, where a 2-to-1 ruling found that a reasonable jury could indeed conclude that the test had been designed to produce a predetermined outcome. A predetermined outcome. Not to assess safety with neutral methodology, but to reach a specific visual result. That is a significant finding, and it received a fraction of the coverage the original rollover footage generated. By the time that ruling came down, it didn't matter anyway. The Samurai had been dead in the U.S. market for years. It was discontinued in 1995. Over 200,000 had been sold in America before the end. The legal settlement came in 2004 with both sides issuing a carefully worded joint statement. Consumer Reports acknowledged they had never intended to imply the Samurai rolled over easily in routine everyday driving conditions. Government studies conducted after the fact confirmed that real-world rollover rates for the Samurai fell within the normal range of comparable utility vehicles on American roads. Here's the detail that should bother anyone who believes the original narrative uncritically. The modern Jeep Wrangler currently holds the second worst rollover probability rating among SUVs tested by federal regulators. Nobody ran that story with the same urgency, the same wall-to-wall television coverage, the same front-page treatment. The physics of a tall, narrow, short-wheelbase vehicle are what they are regardless of the badge on the grille. The Wrangler and the Samurai share the fundamental geometry that makes them exceptional off-road and slightly more rotation-prone than a low-slung sedan. Only one of them had its American career ended by it. While the Samurai was being systematically dismantled by headlines in America, the Jimny quietly continued thriving across the rest of the world. It had company in the lightweight but capable category too. The Soviet Lada Niva, which launched in 1977, took a similar design philosophy and executed it with characteristic Eastern Bloc pragmatism. The Niva's designers literally described their creation as a Renault 5 body placed on a Land Rover chassis, simple framing, but remarkably accurate. The Niva grabbed approximately 40% of the European off-road market by 1978, and even finished second overall in the Paris-Dakar Rally, beating factory Mercedes-Benz and Range Rover entries that cost many times more to develop and prepare. That result sent a very clear message to the expensive end of the market, a message they mostly chose to ignore. But the Niva never matched the Jimny's global reach, its breadth of market penetration, or its generational longevity. The Jimny outlasted them all, and it kept improving with each cycle while retaining the core attributes that made it work. The third generation arrived in 1998 with coil springs replacing the old leaf springs, a notably smoother ride, better suspension articulation over complex terrain, and a more refined feel on paved roads. But the ladder frame remained. The solid axles remained. The transfer case with genuine low range remained. The commitment to mechanical simplicity over electronic complexity remained. And the price point remained accessible in ways that its competitors had long since abandoned. Then came the fourth generation in 2018. And the automotive world went quietly, genuinely insane in response. Suzuki had set a sales target of 15,000 units for Japan's first year of the new model. Orders crossed that number in 30 days. 30 days. Waiting lists in the United Kingdom stretched to a full calendar year. In parts of Southeast Asia, those waiting lists extended to multiple years. Suzuki found themselves in the paradoxical position of being unable to build the thing fast enough to meet demand for a vehicle that had been designed, from the very beginning, to be the affordable option. The option for people who couldn't stretch to the expensive truck. That vehicle was now so desirable that people were waiting years and paying premiums to own it. Suzuki had to suspend Jimny passenger car sales in Europe entirely at one point because the vehicle's carbon dioxide emissions were dragging up their fleet average under EU regulatory frameworks in ways that exposed the company to substantial financial penalties. Their solution was characteristically clever and very Suzuki in its lateral thinking. They removed the rear seats from the vehicle, reclassified the Jimny as a light commercial vehicle under European regulations, and kept selling it. Problem solved. Technically and legally, if not entirely in the spirit of the regulation. When the 5-door Jimny Nomade launched in Japan in April 2025, over 50,000 reservations arrived within 4 days of the announcement. Production capacity had been ramped considerably from 1,200 to 3,300 units per month, and the waiting list still stretched to 4 years. Let that sit for a moment. 4 years. For a budget truck. Used fourth-generation Jimnys, routinely sold above their original retail prices in multiple markets. In Australia, dealer markups of $10,000 above list became standard practice across much of the country. 500 units allocated for a new production batch sold out within 5 hours of the allocation being announced. A vehicle designed from its very first generation to be the cheapest 4x4 on the planet had become so genuinely desirable that people paid significant premiums simply to skip partway through a queue that measured its length in years, not months. The market had spoken in the clearest terms possible. Simplicity, capability, and honesty of purpose create lasting desirability in ways that complexity and feature proliferation often don't. And then there's the American situation, which is its own particular form of irony. 3 million Jimnys sold across 194 countries, and the vehicle is still completely unavailable for road use in the United States. Federal crashworthiness standards, mandatory advanced driver assistance systems, and pedestrian impact protection regulations keep it off American roads. Euro NCAP gave the fourth generation 3 stars, citing specific demerits in pedestrian protection metrics and the absence of certain electronic safety aids now considered baseline in European testing. For the United States market, that isn't remotely close to the minimum required. So the country where the Samurai once outsold the Jeep Wrangler 2-to-1 cannot legally purchase the modern version of the vehicle on a standard title. American enthusiasts who want one badly enough import them through gray market channels, registered as off-road only machines or agricultural equipment, paying substantially inflated prices for a truck that was literally engineered to be affordable. People are paying premiums to acquire a vehicle designed around the principle of financial accessibility, and they're doing it because nothing else on the legal market delivers the same combination of attributes. The irony is structural and complete. It cannot be resolved without either changing American regulations or fundamentally changing the Jimny, and doing the second thing would arguably destroy the first thing that makes anyone want it. Here's what most people don't realize when they step back and look at the full arc of this story. The Jimny didn't just succeed in spite of being cheap and small. It succeeded because of those things, in ways that exposed a fundamental misunderstanding that has guided the off-road vehicle industry for decades. The established players operated on a premise that consumers equate size with capability, and capability with value. Make it bigger, make it heavier, add more power, add more features, charge more money, repeat. Every generation of Land Rover grew heavier, more complex, and more expensive until the Defender became a lifestyle luxury product commanding north of $50,000 with a touchscreen interface larger than some desktop monitors. The Toyota Land Cruiser evolved into a $70,000 premium SUV that the overwhelming majority of its buyers will never intentionally take off sealed pavement. Jeep filled the Wrangler with screens, cameras, adaptive cruise control, lane-keeping assistance systems, and automatic emergency braking. Excellent features for daily commuting. Additional weight, additional complexity, and additional electronic systems requiring dealer-level diagnostic equipment when they malfunction far from civilization. The Jimny stayed small, stayed mechanical, stayed honest about what it was and what it was for, and kept going everywhere the expensive trucks went, frequently going further because it weighed half as much, sat narrower, fit through gaps they couldn't enter, and didn't need a software update to engage four-wheel drive. When the gap in the trees is exactly wide enough for one of them, it is exactly wide enough for the Jimny. The physics are not negotiable regardless of how much anyone paid for their vehicle. The experienced off-roader has known this for 55 years. The broader market took somewhat longer to figure it out, and the waiting lists are the proof of that realization arriving fully formed. Consider the Ojos del Salado story one more time from a different angle. Chrysler sent a professional team with a factory-prepared vehicle and full corporate resources to set an altitude record and announce to the world that their truck was definitively superior. They succeeded. They set a genuine record. They erected their sign and issued their press release. Then two private individuals with a 21-year-old truck they had modified in a personal garage took that record away from them in a single attempt, after recovering from a fire at 20,000 feet. The sign that Chrysler erected, Jeep parking only, all others don't make it up here anyway, is now a souvenir in a Chilean home. The Samurai's record still stands as the highest altitude ever achieved by a standard production vehicle platform. Not the most powerful, not the most expensive, not the most technologically sophisticated, the most capable, which turned out to be a different category entirely from what the marketing suggested. There's a broader lesson buried in the full span of this story that extends well beyond anything specifically automotive. Mikio Suzuki started a loom company because he watched his mother struggle with a tool that could be improved. Osamu Suzuki bought a bankrupt startup's failed prototype, one that had sold 45 units across its entire commercial existence, because he saw potential in the concept that everyone else had dismissed after looking at the sales figures. Their engineers built something smaller and lighter and simpler than anything the established market believed was viable, at a price point the competitors considered commercially reckless. And they spent the next 55 years quietly, consistently embarrassing companies with 10 times the budget, 100 times the engineering staff, military contracts, racing heritage, and decades more accumulated experience in the segment. They did it not by matching those companies feature for feature, specification for specification, but by rejecting the metrics those companies competed on entirely and substituting their own. Weight is the enemy. Simplicity is the virtue. The transfer case ratio matters more than the horsepower figure. The approach angle matters more than the suspension travel number. The vehicle that fits the trail matters more than the vehicle that dominates the spec sheet comparison in a brochure. The Samurai's American story, From the record sales numbers through the Consumer Reports controversy to the legal proceedings that followed, is a masterclass in how quickly public perception can be constructed and destroyed, and how slowly the truth operates relative to a vivid piece of footage played repeatedly on national television. 200,000 vehicles sold in a market the company had to fight to enter, a vehicle that legitimately outsold the most iconic off-road name in America, wiped out by a single magazine article and 30 seconds of video. The facts that emerged over the following 16 years, the NHTSA criticism, the Ninth Circuit finding, the government rollover data, the joint settlement acknowledgement, arrived too slowly and too quietly to rehabilitate the vehicle in the market where it had been so successful. Meanwhile, the rest of the world kept buying Jimnys without interruption. And when the fourth generation arrived in 2018 with its retro styling, its honest mechanical character, and its fundamental refusal to become something it wasn't, the world responded with a demand the company was not remotely prepared to meet. 50,000 reservations in 4 days for the 5-door, 4-year waiting lists. Used vehicles selling above retail. Gray market imports accepted by enthusiasts who simply could not access the vehicle through legal channels in their own country. 3 million Jimnys sold. 194 countries. A Guinness World Record on the highest active volcano on Earth. The best-selling convertible in the United States during its peak years. The fastest-growing Japanese automotive brand entry into the American market on record. The vehicle that Mitsubishi declined to build, based on a design that had sold 45 units total, built by a company that spent its first 60 years making equipment for cotton weavers. That's the story of the Suzuki Jimny. The cheapest 4x4 ever made didn't just survive against the giants of the automotive world, it made them look overcomplicated, overpriced, and fundamentally confused about what off-road capability actually requires. It took their altitude records. It took their sales figures. It outlasted their reputations for toughness. And after 55 years, 4 generations, and 3 million trucks across nearly every country where people drive on dirt, people are still waiting 4 years just for the chance to buy one. That is not a coincidence. That is not nostalgia. That is the market telling you, clearly and repeatedly, that it understands the difference between complexity sold as capability and genuine capability delivered simply. The Jimny understood that difference in 1970. Most of the industry still hasn't caught up. If you've driven one, owned one, or spent years on a waiting list that has outlasted some marriages, drop it in the comments below. I want to know where you are in the queue and whether you think it's worth it. And if you made it this far through the full story, hit subscribe. We do this every single week, and there are more stories exactly like this one waiting for you.